My mom betrayed me. My dad had his own agenda for me, but no. My mother, dreaming of great wealth, left my father and me. My father dreamed that I would follow in his footsteps, but no one asked what I dreamed of. When my father's business got better, she tried to come back as if nothing had happened. But she was wrong. I grew up in a small town near Chicago, and my entire childhood was spent in the shadow of our family machine shop. Dad was a true master of his craft, and I remember spending hours watching him through the dirty window as he tinkered with the next engine. The workshop was our second home, the place where we spent most of our time. I helped Dad wash cars, file tools, and just hung around listening to customers' stories about the good old days. When I got older, my mom left my dad, leaving me behind so he wouldn't get bored. I'm kidding. My dad wouldn't have given me away himself. My mother got tired of my father always fiddling with iron and machinery, covered in machine oil, stinking of gasoline, and not enough money, although I believe that we had enough for a good life. My mom dreamed of more: luxurious houses, expensive cars, and fancy clothes. She dreamed of living in the heart of the big city, not in our quiet neighborhood where the main attraction was our machine shop. She tried to convince her father to change his profession to find something more lucrative, but he remained adamant. For him, the workshop was not just a job, it was his passion, his raison d'etre. Every morning, he would get up with a smile on his face, ready to dive back into the world of engines and transmissions. Mom didn't understand his passion. She felt he was missing opportunities that could have made a difference in our lives. Their fights became more frequent and louder. I remember hiding in my room, trying to drown out the sounds of their arguments with headphones with music. But even then, I could hear my mom screaming that she was tired of this life, and my dad trying to calm her down, telling her that everything would get better, that we just had to wait. Finally, one morning I woke up and found my mom gone. Her things were gone, and on the table was a note: "I'm sorry, but I can't live like this anymore. I wish you happiness." I didn't immediately understand what had happened, but when I realized that Mom was gone, I felt empty inside. My father tried to explain that Mom needed time, that she would come back, but I could see that he doubted it too. After Mom left, our lives changed. Dad spent even more time in the workshop, as if trying to fill the void left by Mom. I helped him as much as I could, washing cars, filing tools, learning to understand engines. It was a shared activity that brought us closer together, despite the pain of loss. At first, I was angry at my mother for leaving, but over time I realized she had her reasons. Dad never complained about fate, but I could see how hard it was for him. He did his best to provide me with everything I needed, and I respected him for that. We became a real team, and the workshop became our second home. Even when I started to get into music and computers, my father supported me, even though he didn't always understand why I needed it. Dad always told me that one day this workshop would be mine. It was a given, as if there was no other way. I remember him looking at me with pride the first time I changed the oil in our neighbor's car by myself. "You did good, son," he'd say, patting me on the shoulder. But the older I got, the more I realized that my interests lay in a completely different realm. When I was still in middle school, I started getting into computer games and social networking. At first, it was simple games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, but soon I was immersed in the world of more complex games like Doom and Quake. Hours flew by as I fought monsters or explored virtual worlds. Social media captured my attention too. I spent hours scrolling through my news feed, chatting with friends, and keeping up with news in the world of technology. Dad noticed these changes, but tried to ignore them. He thought it was just a temporary fad that would soon pass. Sometimes he would try to get me involved in the workshop, offering to help fix cars or just spend time together, but I usually found excuses to stay home and play. I could sense that Dad was disappointed, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. We didn't talk about my mother anymore. My father didn't say anything, and I stayed away from him. Sometimes my mother would call my father and ask how I was, how we were doing, but he always said that everything was fine. I could hear him answering her questions briefly, not allowing himself to go into details. His voice was steady calm, but I knew he was hiding a storm of emotion inside. My mother seemed to sense it too, because the calls became fewer and shorter. One day, when I was already in high school, she called late at night. I heard my dad pick up the phone, froze, but afterward said, "I hear you," and hung up. His face was grim, and I sensed something was wrong. Later, when my father recovered a little, he told me that my mother had met another man and was going to leave with him. I felt angry, resentful, and even jealous. Father was apparently upset too, but tried not to show it. Once, when I couldn't stand it and decided to call her to see how she was doing, she answered coldly and briefly, said she was doing well, but didn't add anything else. I sensed that she didn't want to continue the conversation and hung up, feeling even worse than before. After this incident, I decided that I would not try to contact my mother again. If she decided to start a new life, so be it. One evening when I was immersed in the game again, my dad came into my room. Usually he knocked before entering, but this time he just opened the door and stopped on the threshold. I could feel the tension building in the air, but I kept playing, pretending not to notice his presence. "Hey, son," he said softly, "how long have you been sitting there?" "Not much," I answered, keeping my eyes on the screen. "Just a couple hours." Dad sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed. He was silent for a while, apparently gathering his thoughts. "You know, I understand that you're interested in doing these things," he began. "But I want you to remember that there are more important things than games and social networks. You have a future, and I hope you think about it seriously." His words made me feel guilty, but I didn't want to show it. Instead, I just shrugged and continued playing. "It's okay, Dad," I mumbled. "I'm just having fun. It doesn't mean I'm forgetting the important things." He stood up and came closer, putting his hand on my shoulder. "I believe in you, son," he said. "But sometimes I think you get lost in this virtual world. Remember that real life happens here, outside the computer." After these words, he left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I continued to play, but his words echoed in my head. For the first time, I thought about how much our communication had changed. We used to be able to talk for hours about cars and repairs, but now we could barely find common topics of conversation. But as time went on, our differences became more apparent. We started arguing more often, especially when it came to my future plans. Dad wanted me to go to a technical college for mechanical engineering and continue his work, while I dreamt of an IT career. One evening, after another argument, my dad said to me, "Son, I understand that you like to play, but this is not a profession that can be considered reliable. You have to think about the future." His words hurt me, but I didn't give up. After graduation, I enrolled in an IT college in New York. It was the hardest decision of my life because it meant leaving home, breaking away from the way of life I was used to, and possibly forever with my dad. As I was leaving, we both stood on the porch looking at each other in silence. Dad didn't say a word, but I could see the tears in his eyes. It was a moment I will never forget. My first year of college went by like a blur. I was consumed with studying, new acquaintances, and life in the big city. But despite all these new things, the thought of leaving my father alone never left me. Every time I called home, our conversations were short and formal. Dad avoided discussing my academic progress, preferring to talk about my work in the workshop. I felt that an invisible wall had grown between us, and I didn't know how to break it down. In my second year, I got an internship at a small IT company. The work was interesting, and I was beginning to realize that I had really found my calling. But at the same time, I found myself more and more often thinking that I missed home, the smell of oil and metal, the sounds of tools coming from the workshop. Deep down, I realized that my dad was right. You can't live only in the virtual world. You have to find a balance between your hobbies and reality. When it was time for summer vacation, I decided to return home. I didn't know how my dad would react to my arrival, but I realized that I had to try to restore our relationship. When I arrived, the workshop looked pretty much the same as the day I left. Dad was busy fixing up the old truck, and for a moment I froze on the doorstep, not knowing how to approach him. "Hi, Dad," I finally said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He slowly turned around and looked at me. I couldn't see any emotion on his face, but I noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. "Hey, son," he replied, turning back to the truck. "How's college going?" "Fine," I replied, stepping closer. "Got an internship, learning new things." Dad nodded, but didn't stop working. The silence lengthened, and I realized it was time to start the conversation we've been putting off for a while. "Dad, I want to apologize," I started, "for leaving so abruptly, for not being there for you. I know you wanted me to stay and help you with the workshop, but—" He held up his hand, stopping me. "Let's not talk about it," he said, sighing heavily. "I realize that everyone has their own path. The important thing is that you're happy and that you find your place in life." We talked a little about my achievements in college and how things are going in the workshop. Gradually, the conversation became livelier, and I felt that the ice between us began to melt. Dad told me about some of the problems he'd been having lately, and I offered to help. Although he refused at first, he eventually agreed that some modern technology could make his job easier. Thus began a new chapter in our relationship. I helped Dad implement order management and parts accounting software and taught him the basics of computers. We started spending time together again, discussing not only work but also my progress in the IT field. It was a moment I had been waiting for my whole life. Dad began to see that my knowledge could be useful not only in the virtual world, but also in real life. Over time, our workshop became more modern and efficient. There were more customers and our income increased. Dad finally recognized that my decisions were the right ones, and we were able to find a balance between tradition and innovation. Our relationship was restored, and I realized that despite all our differences, family always comes first. And then my mother showed up. She arrived unexpectedly, without warning, and immediately began to cry that her man turned out to be a liar and generally treated her badly. It didn't touch me at all. I saw that she came back for the money, and I felt sorry for my father. He had suffered for so many years from her absence, worked hard to provide for me, and she had just come back as if nothing had happened. But my father surprised me. Instead of listening to her complaints and trying to help her, he calmly went to the closet, pulled out a folder, and handed it to my mother. Inside were divorce papers. I couldn't believe my eyes. All this time he'd been saving them, preparing for the moment she decided to come back. But instead of trying to win her back, he took the final step, closing this chapter of their life together. The mother stood at a loss, not knowing what to say. She expected sympathy, support, but received a cold response. Her father looked at her and said, "Read this carefully. Everything you need to know is here. Sign it and you can leave." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She took the papers and left the house without a word. I stood still, dumbfounded by what I had seen. I never thought my father was capable of such a thing. I always thought he was soft and kind, ready to forgive any mistakes. But apparently, even he has a limit to his patience. After she left, my father sat on the couch and was silent for a long time. I went up to him and asked him, "Dad, why did you do that?" He looked at me and answered, "Because I was tired of waiting. Tired of hoping that she would come back and everything would be like it was before. She's made her choice, and I'm not going to waste any more time and energy on her. You and I are starting a new life now, son." Those words sounded like a revelation to me. I realized that my father had really changed. He had become stronger, more determined, and I respected him for that. From then on, we never spoke of my mother again. She signed the papers and disappeared from our lives completely. We continued to live as we had before, but now we had a sense of freedom and confidence in the future.